Welcome to literary and jury charge practice. Let's start out with some jury charge. Ready? Here we go. The act of making copyrighted sound recordings available for electronic distribution on a peer-to-peer network without license from the copyright owners violates the copyright owner's exclusive right of distribution, regardless of whether actual distribution has been shown. If you find that Plaintiff Capitol Records, Inc. had a valid copyright and you find that that copyright was infringed by defendant, then you should fine for Plaintiff Capitol Records, Inc. You must then decide on the amount of damages Plaintiff Capitol Records, Inc. is entitled to recover. If, however, you find that such plaintiff did not prove an infringement by defendant, you should fine for defendant and not decide any amount of damages. If you find that plaintiff Sony BMG Music Entertainment had a valid copyright and you find that that copyright was infringed by defendant, then you should fine for plaintiff Sony BMG Music Entertainment. You must then decide on the amount of damages plaintiff Sony BMG Music Entertainment is entitled to recover. If, however, you find that such plaintiff did not prove an infringement by defendant, you should fine for defendant and not decide any amount of damages. If you find that Plaintiff Artista Records LLC had a valid copyright and you find that that copyright was infringed by defendant, then you should fine for Plaintiff Arista Records LLC and you must then decide on the amount of damages Plaintiff Arista Records LLC is entitled to recover. If, however, you find that such plaintiff did not prove an infringement by defendant, you should fine for defendant and not decide any amount of damages. If you find that Plaintiff Interscope Records had a valid copyright and you find that that copyright was infringed by defendant, then you should fine for Plaintiff Interscope Records. You must then decide on the amount of damages Plaintiff Interscope Records is entitled to recover. If, however, you find that such plaintiff did not prove an infringement by defendant, you should fine for defendant and not decide any amount of damages. If you find that Plaintiff Warner Brothers Records, Inc. had a valid copyright and you find that that copyright was infringed by defendant, then you should fine for Plaintiff Warner Brothers Records, Inc. You must then decide on the amount of damages Plaintiff Warner Brothers Records, Inc. is entitled to recover. If, however, you find that such plaintiff did not prove an infringement by defendant, you should fine for defendant and not decide any amount of damages. If you find that Plaintiff UMG Recordings, Inc. had a valid copyright and you find that that copyright was infringed by defendant, then you should fine for Plaintiff UMG Recordings, Inc. You must then decide on the amount of damages Plaintiff UMG Recordings, Inc. is entitled to recover. If, however, you find that such plaintiff did not prove an infringement by defendant, you should fine for defendant and not decide any amount of damages. In this case, each plaintiff has elected to recover statutory damages instead of its actual damages and profits. Under the Copyright Act, each plaintiff is entitled to a sum of not less than $750 or more than $30,000 per act of infringement, that is, per sound recording downloaded or distributed without license as you consider just. If, however, you find that the defendant's conduct was willful, then each plaintiff is entitled to a sum up to $150,000 per act of infringement, that is, per sound recording downloaded or distributed without license as you consider just. In determining the just amount of statutory damages for an infringing defendant, you may consider the willfulness of the defendant's conduct, the defendant's innocence, the defendant's continuation of infringement after notice, or knowledge of the copyright, or in reckless disregard of the copyright, effect of the defendant's prior or concurrent copyright infringement activity, and whether profit or gain was established. Willful means that a defendant had knowledge that his or her actions constituted copyright infringement. There are two types of evidence that are generally presented during a trial: direct evidence and circumstantial evidence. Direct evidence is the testimony of a person who asserts or claims to have actual knowledge of a fact, such as an eyewitness. Circumstantial evidence is proof of a chain of facts and circumstances indicating the existence of a fact. The law makes no distinction between the weight or value to be given to either direct or circumstantial evidence, nor is a greater degree of certainty required of circumstantial evidence than of direct evidence. You should weigh all the evidence in the case. The knowledge that a person possesses at any given time may not ordinarily be proved directly, because there is no way of directly scrutinizing the workings of the human mind. In determining the issue of what a person knew at a particular time, you may consider any statements made or acts done by that person, and all other facts and circumstances received in evidence which may aid in your determination of that person's knowledge. In conducting your deliberations and returning your verdict, there are certain rules you must follow. First, when you go to the jury room, you must select one of your members as your foreperson. That person will preside over your discussions and speak for you here in court. Second, it is your duty as jurors to discuss this case with one another in the jury room. You should try to reach agreement if you can do so without violence to individual judgment, because a verdict must be unanimous. Each of you must make your own conscientious decision, but only after you have considered all the evidence, discussed it fully with your fellow jurors, and listened to the views of your fellow jurors. Do not be afraid to change your opinions if the discussion persuades you that you should, but do not come to a decision simply because other jurors think it is right, or simply to reach a verdict. Remember at all times that you are not partisans, you are judges of the facts. Your sole interest is to seek the truth from the evidence in the case. Third, if you need to communicate with me during your deliberations, you may send a note to me through the court security officer signed by one or more jurors. I will respond as soon as possible, either in writing or orally in open court. Remember that you should not tell anyone, including me, how your votes stand numerically. Fourth, your verdict must be based solely on the evidence and on the law that I have given to you in my instructions. The verdict must be unanimous. Nothing I have said or done is intended to suggest that your verdict should be. That is entirely for you to decide. Finally, the verdict form is simply the written notice of the decision that you reach in this case. You will take this form to the jury room, and when each of you has agreed on the verdicts, your foreperson will fill in the form, sign and date it, and advise the court security officer that you are ready to return to the courtroom. All right, that ends that particular jury charge. Let's see what we have here. Maybe we'll finish up this literary that we had started. About Journey House. Ready? Here we go. Dominique Revis's world turned upside down when she was 7 years old, after her mother was arrested for drug possession during a domestic dispute and her father was nowhere to be found. Revis and her siblings were separated and placed into different foster families. Although she had some contact with her 8 siblings and members of her family, life was not the same, but she learned to adapt to her new life and environment. She studied hard in school, earning all A's, and developed a knack for mock trial competitions and the art of argument. She had her sights set on a bright future. Like most children in the foster care system, Revis suddenly found herself alone when she turned 18. Her foster family had moved out of state, and the only source of income she had was her part-time job at Baskin-Robbins. It helped her get by, but did not let her pursue her dreams of going to college. After I was emancipated from the system, I pretty much was living on friends' couches, Revis said, but nothing could keep her down. She worked hard to make it possible to get through Pasadena Community College, which led to many connections and ultimately Journey House. It was there she received grants and scholarships needed to be able to attend the University of La Verne. I remember I was excited to be attending La Verne, but scared because I had nowhere to live. I was lucky to eventually find a scholarship that could pay for me to live on campus, Revis said. She excelled at La Verne, and while working 3 jobs, she earned her degree in speech communication in May 2014. Going to college was always one of my main goals. At La Verne, I was able to stay on the right path with the help of professors like Ian specializing in the speech communication department, and I developed the skills I needed to make it in the business world, Rivas said. I'm the only one who went to college and actually graduated. I tried to be an inspiration to my brothers and sisters. Today she is a personal banker and has plans to return to school to pursue a graduate degree. Get back to our literary about the Alaskan Highway. Yes, the Alaska Highway. Ready? Here we go. By now, I've discovered the casual friends on the road. The same folks in RVs and campers wave at me as we leapfrog along. Equally friendly are the southbound travelers I chat with while gassing up. From Whitehorse, the Alcan makes its way to the Alaska border. Barely 200 miles of the original highway are actually inside Alaska, but I have one more step before I reach it. I've been driving, hiking, and even hot tub soaking my way up the legendary highway, seeing it from the ground. Now it's time to see it from the air. 45 minutes outside Haines Junction, Yukon, in the shade of the mighty St. Elias Range, I climb into Tom Bradley's single-engine plane. Tom's a pilot with Icefield Discovery Tours, an outfitter running aerial sightseeing tours, and a remote glacier camp. As we gain speed and bounce down the runway, Tom keys the headset mic. We've got the largest non-polar ice field in the world up here, but you can't see it from the highway. It's hidden by the mountains. As we buzz up a narrow valley, he points out a perforated line stitching the muddy riverbank and says, "Grizzly tracks." We skim off a nearby ridge and he nods at an alpine meadow dotted with white puffs. Doll sheep. They keep their lambs up here where they're safe from wolves. Then the windshield fills with a prehistoric sight, thousands of square miles of ice and stone. The plane bucks, winds rolling off the glaciers. Tom banks sharply, and I stare down into sapphire crevices and Bahama blue ice pools. The peaks towering above us are impressive. I ask Tom their names. There are too many, he says with a shrug. The mountains up here are nameless. The next morning I cross the Alaska border and the land flattens once again. The road is smoother and busier, and I see more towns and gas stations. It's as if the Alaska Highway wants to let me down easily into civilization again. I pull into the visitor center in Delta Junction. I sign the guest register under the watchful eye of a stuffed bison and head outside to the three-sided white mile 1422 marker. The sign is as tall as a Kodiak bear. American and Canadian flags snap in the wind. A motorcyclist from Germany asked if I could take an iPhone photo of him in front of the sign. He's kitted up in a new neon green motorcycle jacket and his bike is shiny. I tell him I've just finished the drive. He shakes my hand as if I'm a celebrity. Is it still wild, he asks. Oh yes, I say. The first few hours are mellow, but once you hit the Yukon, you'll find the Alaska Highway you're looking for. It's so wild that the mountains are nameless. He nods his head with a big grin. I hand him his iPhone and watch him walk back to his bike, snug on his helmet, and roar out of the parking lot and down the highway until his green jacket vanishes in the afternoon heat ripples. Let's see about finishing up our government's proposed jury instructions. Ready? Here we go. In order for you to find defendants Riley, Gerhard, and or Gonzalez guilty of carrying or using a firearm in connection with a crime of violence or possessing a firearm in furtherance of a crime of violence as charged in counts 4, 5, and 6 respectively, you must unanimously agree that the government has proven the following 3 elements beyond a reasonable doubt. First, the defendant A conspired to prevent officers of the United States from discharging their duties as charged in count 1, or B conspired to interfere with federal law enforcement officers in the discharge of their duties as alleged in count 2. Second, the defendant knowingly used or carried a firearm in connection with one of those crimes of violence, or that the defendant possessed a firearm in furtherance of one of those crimes. And third, the defendant's use of the firearm played at least an indirect role in the crime of violence. The term firearm means any weapon which will or is designed to or may readily be converted to expel a projectile by the action of an explosive. The law recognizes 2 kinds of possession, actual possession and constructive possession. A person who knowingly has direct physical control over an item at a given time actually possesses the item. A person who, although not in actual possession, knowingly has both the power and the intention at a given time to exercise dominion or control over an item, or to exercise dominion or control over the area in which the item is found, whether directly or through another person, constructively possesses the item. A crime of violence means an offense that is a felony and has an element, the use, attempted use, or threatened use of physical force against the person or property of another, or that by its nature involves a substantial risk that physical force against the person or property of another may be used in the course of committing the offense. You may find a defendant guilty of the firearms offenses that are charged in counts 4, 5, and 6 if you determine that Gerhard, Gonzalez, and or Riley aided and abetted the commission of the offenses. A person aids and abets the commission of a crime when they intentionally help someone else commit the crime. To establish that if a defendant aided and abetted the commission of an offense, the government must prove beyond a reasonable doubt that 1. Someone other than the defendant committed the charged crime, and 2. The defendant willfully associated himself in some way with the crime and participated in the crime as he would in something he wished to bring about. In other words, the government must prove that a defendant consciously shared the other person's knowledge of the underlying criminal act and intended to help that person commit the offense. The defendant need not perform the underlying criminal act, be present when it is performed, or be aware of the details of its execution to be guilty of aiding and abetting. On the other hand, a general suspicion that an unlawful act may occur or that something criminal is happening is not enough. Mere presence at the scene of a crime and knowledge that a crime is being committed are also not sufficient to establish aiding and abetting. You may also find a defendant guilty of the firearm offenses that are charged in counts 4, 5, and 6 if you unanimously agree that the defendant could have reasonably foreseen but not actually known that another conspirator used or carried a firearm during or in relation to a crime of violence, or that the conspirator possessed a firearm in furtherance of a crime of violence. Count 4 of the indictment alleges that defendant Gerhard carried or used a destructive device in connection with a crime of violence, or that he possessed a destructive in furtherance of a crime of violence. Defendant Riley is charged with the same offense in count 6. In this regard, the indictment alleges from in or around January 2007 through in or around September 2007 in the District of New Hampshire and elsewhere, the defendants, Jason Gerhard and Daniel Riley, knowingly and intentionally A. carried or used one or more of the destructive devices identified in the indictment during and in relation to crimes of violence for which he could be prosecuted in a court of the United States, to wit, 1. Conspiracy to forcibly assault, resist, oppose, impede, intimidate, and interfere with federal law enforcement in the official discharge of their duties, attempting to arrest Edward Brown and Elaine Brown in violation of Title 18 United States Code Sections 371 and 111A1, or 2. Conspiracy to prevent officers of the United States from discharging their duties in violation of Title 18 United States Code Section 372, or B, in furtherance of such crime of violence, possessed one or more firearms, including destructive devices, all in violation of Title 18 United States Code, Sections 924C1A and 924C1B11, in order for you to find defendants Riley and or Gerhard guilty of carrying or using a destructive device in connection with a crime of violence, or that they possessed a destructive device in furtherance of a crime of violence as charged in counts 4 and 6 respectively, you must unanimously agree that the government has proven the following 3 elements beyond a reasonable doubt. First, that the defendant A conspired to prevent officers of the United States from discharging their duties as charged in count 1, or B conspired to interfere with federal law enforcement officers in the discharge of their duties as alleged in count 2. And we will stop there, and that will conclude our literary and jury charge practice.